Sounds good.
All right, now it's recording. All right, 30 minutes. Okay. Well, so this is a methods paper where we, advocate certain recommendations, and we provide, empirical examples, theoretical argument, and simulation evidence. So all three kind of layers of argumentation, they point to the same thing. So for example, if one layer doesn't speak to you, you can always appeal to the other one. Alrighty. All right, so this is a motivation, and this figure shows two time series. One is one red line shows an increasing number. Guys, I forgot to announce that. Please, just if you have any thoughts, impressions, or questions, please jump in. I think that would be better than just holding on to all the questions. So I'm here. I have a I'm here. We can talk. All right. So the figure, back to the figure. So the figure shows two time series. One, the red line shows there is a growing number of CRTs each year, and so CRTs is just a clinical trial where randomization occurs in the cluster level, and the other kind of emerging time series shows us that a growing share of those CRTs follows a pragmatic approach, and pragmatic approach, loosely speaking, can be understood as a very messy clinical trial. So instead of just trying to evaluate an intervention using ideal conditions, a clinical setting is used. And the prime example of pragmatic approach is the registry-based trials, where data which has been initially collected for something else is being repurposed for the trial. And so I'll be presenting this to econometricians. So I will now make a reference. So this should be familiar to econometricians because they have been linking administrative data sets for decades, to identify certain effects. So it's a similar sort of thing. Well, at this point, throughout this paper, and it's very kind of useful to contrast two disciplines. So this comparison is stylistic; it's not exact, but it's very useful to kind of have this kind of conflict in mind because it just makes for a better story. And so, but anyway, so it's biostatistics and. So the both disciplines, they try to pin down the causal effects, but biostatisticians, they do it within a clinical trial, domain. Econometricians doing it within a within the sort of quasi-experimental settings. Biostatisticians usually, because they, because of the physical randomization, they control all aspects of the design, and they know all aspects of the design. And they usually use smaller sample size, which are very hard to come by. For example, it might be financially costly, or it could be costly in terms of patients' pain. So it's sometimes some patients undergo fake surgeries, to be a good control group. And in a setting like this, efficiency is critical. So we can't just say we're not sure what the result is. It's important to get the result because we know all the design aspects, biostatisticians tend to use tools which allow to express more opinions about the effect. For example, in some settings, cluster equicorrelation is sometimes an appropriate modeling technique which simplifies data uncertainty and allows to reduce standard errors. So another prime example is the Bayesian approach, which merges effects across settings. This is also and this allows biostatisticians leverage their knowledge of the design and be able to say something, even when the data is rare. So econometricians, they usually know only main aspects of the design, but the good thing is that they usually have larger sample sizes, and which are also easy to come by. So they might be using administrative data sets or publicly available data. In a setting like this, it's important to use methods which only leverage the design's main aspects, which we can ascertain, while the methods should be robust to arbitrary second aspects of the design. And in the econometricians, usually they emphasize the clarity of the assumptions, and they don't allow, for example, Bayesian methods are not commonly used in econometrics because there's too many kind of choices biostatisticians have to make. Well, so the key insight of this is that pragmatic designs, they deviate from a traditional biostatistical challenges, and they become more similar to econometrics challenges. And they can and you know, cluster heterogeneity, which is at the center of this paper, it has received particular attention in econometric literature. But what's interesting is that to develop this paper, I have been reading recent papers in econometrics, but then I ended up reading papers about statistics from 1980. So everything I'm talking about is just good old statistics, which has been known for a while. Anyway, so the objective here is to ensure that pragmatic designs can still be approached and can be robust in a sense that they don't lead to false positive, and efficient in the sense that they do not lead to false negatives. And with develop, we can read across literature, and we come up with the two recommendations. Is that so recommendation number one is that there should be should not rely on assumption of equicorrelation, which is ubiquitous in biostatistics, and instead of use kind of distribution-free deletion diagnostics. And it's a perfectly timed a package came out which called SumClust, which has a very excellent documentation, and it's available in Stata and R, and it can perform this diagnostic just with one line of coding. And so second recommendation is that we kind of advocate for using, first of all, we're using robust model, which guards against false positive results. And for CRT, it happens to be there's nearly a perfect model that we argue that everyone should be used. And it's very convenient model because it can be used universally for any CRTs because it it allows for arbitrary correlations across and within clusters. And then if this result is not satisfactory, the result is still missing, then we recommend transition to more efficient model, which are more familiar to biostats people, but then report the results next to a robust model. All right, so let's just go again. Let's go. So these are recommendations, and let me give you again what recommendations mean in practice. For example, so in practice, our recommendations is to include these two tables into trials. And let's look at this trial. This is an example trial. So in this trial, there is nine clusters. And the author selected cluster level random intercept model, which assumes cluster equicorrelation, but that should be okay because they also use CV1 variance estimator, and CV1 can theoretically guard against cluster, guard against can robustify, the assumption of cluster equicorrelation, so it kind of allows for some degree of arbitrariness within and between clusters. But the problem with the setting is that when you have 9 clusters, CV1 doesn't have a bite. It doesn't actually do this. It's still, and therefore the kind of consistency of standard errors here then falls back on the assumption of cluster equicorrelation. As you can see, this model also shows the result is present. So it shows statistically significant result using this model. Again, so now, as I said, the identification falls on the assumption of cluster equicorrelation. And then this is where the SumClust packages can be used. And this is, let me talk about table 1 now. So the most elementary measure of cluster heterogeneity is how many observations is there per cluster. If we can also characterize this heterogeneity using one number, and that's why the bottom of the table includes the coefficient of variance based on these numbers. And for example, if cluster equicorrelation was a valid assumption, then the variance would be 0. So the package also reports 2 other statistics which also identify cluster heterogeneity, but for more complex data cases. For example, leverage shows, for example, what happens when cluster 1 is excluded and how residuals change. And so all of this is based on the linear model. And so, for example, this in a simple case, leverage should be just proportional to the number of observations, but it may not be if, in some, that's why it's a more kind of richer characterization of cluster heterogeneity. And so another one is a partial leverage, and that kind of shows what happens to the estimated treatment effect when you exclude the cluster. And loosely speaking, these are the treatment weights. All right, so the last thing that the package reports, it reports the lead cluster effect. So what happens to the treatment effect when you exclude each cluster? And you can see what's critical here is that the treatment effect flips sign, and that's a really giveaway. that there is a massive cluster heterogeneity. So that basically tells us that the cluster correlation is an implausible assumption. And so then when we use our recommended benchmark, which is just Poisson model with the jackknife variance estimator, or CV3, and we see that once you account for the actual uncertainty in the data, the effect goes away. And so when you kind of report results this way, so the thing about, for a given trial, we don't actually know what's the effect. That's the idea of evaluation. But having these two tables give us a very clear kind of expression of the notion that any treatment effect is dependent on the assumption. So that kind of emphasizes the clarity of assumptions. All right, so the recommendation also do not have to change the conclusion. For example, if you look at the trial where cluster equicorrelation is a viable assumption, the effect does not change. So in both cases, the conclusions, the effects is statistically significant, conclusions are unchanged. All right, so let me just kind of move to, these are empirical examples and demonstration of our recommendation. And now let's move to, why is our benchmark is working better from theoretical perspective. So let's look at the variance covariance matrix. So VCM is the measure of data dependency, and so we use that matrix to calculate standard errors, which are then later used to judge the statistical significance inference. And so let's look at the empirically implausible but theoretically convenient case of IID errors, identical and independent distributed errors. And this matrix, it kind of shows that the errors are identical, and that captured with the fact that all on diagonal variables are the same. So and independence in this VCM captures independence by having zeros off main diagonal. So for example, observation 1 is independent of observation 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and everything varies the same way. And this is also known as homoscedasticity. And let's look at the let's look at VCM for just an example CRT. And CRTs, they have two violations of IID errors. So a violation number 1 is that that the it's called heteroscedasticity, is that this data is not distributed identically. So you see that each value on the main diagonal has a subscript, so it's individual number, so it doesn't have to be the same. And CRTs also violate the assumption of independence. For example, this matrix shows that observation number 2 correlates with observation 3 and 4. And so in this example captures three features which are common in CRTs, particularly in pragmatic designs, is that there tend to be few clusters, not as little as 3 clusters. That's nuts. You can't really do inference with 3 clusters, but there's usually few clusters and have different sizes, and they have to have unique correlation within and between clusters. And so what's the current practice in biostatistics is to pretend that is to impose assumption of cluster equicorrelation, which basically means that all the coefficients of the main diagonal is one parameter, and it's the same for all clusters, and elements on the main diagonal is another parameter. So essentially it simplifies the uncertainty, which improves the efficiency, but it also might produce false positive results. And so this approach. So this approach of explicitly modeling various covariance metrics still can be done even when you have very complex correlation structures. But then, for example, in GEE framework, you can specify unstructured VCM. But the problem with this approach is that the computational issues escalate substantially. For example, an R package for GE model explicitly recommends not to use unstructured variance covariance metrics because it might crash R. So the other approach, completely different approach, which is to actually do not model correlation explicitly, but instead use variance covariance metrics, which allows for arbitrary correlations, within and between clusters. And so this is the approach that we recommend, and this is actually the approach that has been recommended by the Ling and Zegger, who developed GE model. this is actually they're talking about this. We're gonna anyway. So there's two distinctions. So there's explicit modeling of various covariance metrics, which improves efficiency but might lead to false positive. And there is another school of thought which you can just capture these complex correlations via variance covariance estimator, and it's computationally easy to implement. And so another problem with using explicit modeling of variance covariance metrics is that you may simply fail to converge your model, or what's more dangerous, you may converge model silently to incorrect value, and you would just simply get the wrong result. It basically creates a fragile inference. So this problem is not an issue when you use our benchmark, our recommended benchmark. Alrighty, all right. So this is the same idea, but using the equations. And so this is just a GEE model. So for example, the highlighted equations here, this is simply GLM. So in this case, let's say we have a clustered data and we specify conditional mean function. And what's really beautiful about cluster trials is that it's always correct. And so we can also specify variance, which is in this case is just elements on the main diagonal of the VCM. And for example, this looks ugly, but it's actually quite simple. For example, for OLS model, for a linear model, that would be just one parameter phi. For Poisson model, it would be just this element only without all this stuff. And so you can work out estimator using these two definitions. And so this estimator, as is well known, will give you consistent parameters, consistent point estimate, and it only requires the correctly specified conditional mean function. So again, innovation number one of the GE of the Liang and Zegger of 1986 is that they introduced so-called CV1, which is now known as CV1. It's a cluster robust variance estimator, and so they show in example number one in their paper is that in a GLM, in this simplified, this is our benchmark too. So so they show that you can actually consistently estimate standard errors and the point estimate. So point estimate and standard errors. So you get point estimate using estimator and standard errors using this variance estimator, and you don't have to assume anything in the variance covariance metrics. So our benchmark is actually a bit different. It's the same idea, but instead of using CV1, we suggest using CV3 because subsequent work showed that CV1 is also prone to over-rejection, prone to false significance if clusters are too unbalanced though, and therefore this is our benchmark. So use linear or Poisson model because they are very computationally efficient, and use CV3. And so, but what's the other innovation of GE model is that they show that you actually can improve efficiency. You can make asymptotics kick in faster. You can you can reduce your standard errors if you also specify explicitly variance covariance metrics. For example, in the cluster equicorrelation, you can specify cluster equicorrelated model, which sort of assumes that clusters are all the same, and you will improve the efficiency of your estimator. You will get smaller standard errors, and this improvement would be proportional to how close your specified variance covariance metrics, on the cluster level, is close to the true variance metrics. And then he says that you still can do this, but if you use CV1, that would robustify your choice. And so, for example, you may get efficiency by specifying metrics, and then you can guard your choice by using cluster robust errors. And essentially, GE includes both of schools of thought, but somehow biostats forgot that you don't have to explicit model a variance covariance. So it's there's two schools of thought in GE model, and the econometricians borrowed variance covariance estimator, robust to cluster correlation, and the biostats people borrowed explicit modeling of variance covariance metrics. Okay, so just to complete the picture, if researchers are extremely confident in their specified variance covariance metrics, you actually don't have to robustify, because when you use CV1, CV3, you robustify your choice of variance covariance metrics, but you also get slightly bigger standard errors. And so you actually don't have to do this if you use just a default. If you're very confident, if you don't have to robustify, you can you can use a simpler variance estimator, and then you get the smallest errors possible. But also you have to be very confident about what you're doing. All right, so this is again.
Okay, can I ask a question? Thinking about this, the level of confidence for a trialist. You might be confident if you see that your clusters are all the same size, for instance. But how would you be confident about the variance between clusters? Because you talked earlier about how this method is needed because of the unique within and between cluster variances. So one is around cluster size, but there's a whole lot of other unknowns. So what is it that a trialist needs to know in order to be confident?
Yeah, well, that's the thing about, and this is a very good question, is that even when you have clusters of equal size, you still can't be certain that the variation between clusters is the same. And actually, it's actually it sort of I discussed this in the paper a bit, and actually my simulations subsequent, actually I have a particular simulation that stressed this quality of CRTs. Is that, let me just look at the metrics. So look at this. Even if we have homoscedastic errors, even if they say that cluster across variance across clusters is the same, let's say this is just one number, you would have to know that you still would get anyway. So this diagnostic, this sum class diagnostic, would be able to ascertain that. For example, so cluster, so like I said, so for example, cluster correlation. For example, when you use leverage and partial leverage, that would account for all sorts of because it's sort of distribution free. I'm not really asking a question.
Looking at the diagnostics, possibly having pilot data on your clusters that I don't
understand. I know that people, I don't understand how pilot data is useful at all. It's a different setting. It's having pilots. It's a, first of all, yeah, there's a pilot in the name, but it's still a different study. And if it's a different study, you can't just take aspects of data process from one study and put it into the other. It's just, I don't really understand this. But the bottom line is, so
we can discuss that later. But
I mean, it doesn't speak to me. I see bias that people doing this, but it just makes no sense. But anyway, so a recommendation that is present here, it, like I said, so it has to be respected bias that people have to get the results sometimes, especially clinicians and government, they what's the answer? It's kind of hard to say. And that's why our recommendation is not based on one model. It's based kind of on the principles. And the principle is that any causal claim is kind of based on assumptions. And if assumptions are valid, then we can claim causality. And in this kind of framework, it's all really about transparency of the assumptions. Is that, for example, a benchmark model, it's very robust to correlation structures, but it might be inefficient. That's true. So it might kind of standard errors might be like slightly higher than correctly specified variance metrics. But that's why we don't argue against other models, because for a given trial, you don't really know what the effect is. And therefore, it's really good to have both models. And then having table 2 is again have both models, and then table 1 would show you how plausible is it that your efficient model, how plausible are the assumptions of the efficient model. Anyways, we got another 7 minutes. Thank you for the question, Rachel. I'm sorry, I probably didn't answer that very well. But the thing is, there's no silver bullet. Any model is assumption driven, and sometimes you just can't know. And that's kind of why I'm saying that the kinematrics is useful here, because they develop their methods is around approaches which work well only when we know very little. And the beauty about the approach with benchmark that we recommend is that it only depends. So the consistency of the estimator only depends on the correctly specified conditional mean function. That's a very important statement, because in conditional mean function, cluster trials is always correct because it's physical randomization. In econometrics with quasi experiments, we never know what's the correct specification, because we just don't know what's random. But in clinical, we always know that, and our point estimate is always correct. But the problem is standard errors, and we can CV1 is not working very well when you have few unbalanced classes, but CV3 works really well, and we have decades of simulation evidence for that. And that's why our benchmark, for example, it's very hard to draw a line about what's the correct model, how stringent your assumptions should be. But it's just, we got so lucky is that we have a model that can just work for CRT so well, and that's our benchmark. Anyways, sorry, Rachel. Sorry for this ramble. Hope it helps maybe a little bit. Simulation evidence. Okay, so
Thanks. Yeah, that's good.
so simulation evidence. Okay, so let's, because we have theoretic arguments, we have some clinical examples, but let's just simulate a trial and see how a method really works when we actually know the process. And so in this trial, we start with the normal random effect model, and we start with the equicorrelated clusters. And we have our treatment dummy, and in the true process, Bx, our treatment, is actually 0. So there's no effect, it's 0. We generate that, we know that. And so now we're gonna run a bunch of models, and we will show that once you kind of make correlation structures complicated enough, then the models that are commonly used in biostats, they show the result, whereas we know it's absent. And so this is scenario number 1, is this is kind of gamma number 1, the bluish thing. And so what it does, it actually creates heteroskedasticity. It complicates, so so we still, in the data, we still see clusters of the same size, but we make correlation between clusters more extreme and extreme. And for example, and why is it a bit complicated? Why is it just not this parameter? Because we want to keep the average variance the same. So the average variance in this data process is the same, but it becomes more and more extreme. So why that's interesting. Let's say why would heteroscedasticity, this may just give an example just for better intuition. I have 4 minutes. So for example, let's say that if you are clinical, let's say that if you don't have much money, you'll be eating bad food because you don't have money for better food. But if you're rich, you still can eat bad food, but you also can afford to eat good food. And this is a very elementary example of heteroskedasticity, and why would, for example, clusters be different? They might be the same within. Why would clusters be always between correlation should be? Why heteroskedasticity would be present in CRTs? And the examples just would be, so let's say one cluster is closer to the football field or something. There's so many reasons why clusters would be different, why correlation between clusters would be different. Anyway, so this is scenario number 1. We keep clusters the same, but complicate correlation between clusters. And scenario number 2, is more complicated, and it basically induces the size of the clusters change, and the higher this parameter, then the more unbalanced they become. So in extreme case, you have one cluster, which basically most of observations, and then a bunch of small ones. And let's look at the results. And in this results, for example, we want to look at, so this is scenario number 1. Left figure shows scenario number 1. And so here we have our baseline model, and we can see that all 3 models, so this is GE random effect default variance, so it's not this is a cluster equicorrelated model, but not robustified. Then we have robustified random cluster equicorrelated model. Then we have beige model, and then we have our benchmark. So the model which is closest to this line is the best. So we can see that in the beginning, when we have the most simplified process, then all the models correctly say that there's no effect. But once the correlation become more complicated, then we see that all of the models, because they depend on the assumption of correlation structures, they show the result, whereas we know the results is just not there. So this is scenario number 1. Again, our benchmark is, in this case, it's an orange line, and it's very, very straight line. So in the beginning, it might under reject. So it's, like I said, this is why we need a efficient model, because when it might be too conservative. But when it goes high, so this is just a frequency. So so if it's higher than this, then it means that model shows significance. And then we can see that all the models that random effect models, or random effect models which are using CV1, which is too optimistic. Anyway, so that's now support for the our recommended benchmark, and also there's just so much literature on this. It's just really if you just pay attention to literature, you don't really have to read this paper. Anyway, simulation results and also conclusions. All right, so we developed easily implementable recommendations for CRTs. It's robust in statistical sense and computationally robust too. It's mature, easy to implement. It's going to be no issue of convergence, and it can be implemented for all CRTs, but pragmatic designs is just super critical. Another thing, and this is a work in progress, and I hope that there's going to be some biostats people, and I would kind of say that I'm happy to join forces if someone is interested, but I send email to the wrong people. And so this this paper is going to be going in one of these journals once it's complete. Alrighty, 30 minutes. I did it.
Well done. Thanks a lot, Sergey. So yeah, I've got a couple of things that I think might be useful pointers about your presentation, but I'll save that until the end. So the dozen or so people who are online, does anyone want to come off mute and ask questions for clarification or make suggestions about the presentation or the content?
Hi, Sergey. I have thanks for your nice presentation. I have the couple of observations. If you go to the table 2.
Which slide, Rashid?
Table 2. Actually, forget about the table 2. This the table 2.
Table 2. Oh, table 2. I'm sorry.
No, sorry, Matthew.
Yeah, not right.
Yeah, slide 8.
According to this, the recommended benchmark. What about your recommendation? And if you use the benchmark as a robust estimation, this robust estimation is the high level uncertainty. And if you say this one is the robust, and if it is the high level uncertainty, what's your justification for your recommendation to use the recommended benchmark? Because if you look at this, the 95% confident interval, it is the high level uncertainty.
Well, yeah. Well, it's kind of like, so this paper I presented 3 types of arguments which point to this benchmark. And so if you remember, one of them was that this model from theoretical perspective and simulation evidence, this is the model that works, that allows for arbitrary correlations between clusters. And the table 1 tells you that it is a necessity for this setting because it's very complex. And this is the uncertainty reported by this model is the valid measure of uncertainty. So, and the model below so hinges on the assumptions which are just less plausible. And also, but again, it's very important for a given trial, we never know what the result is, what the true effect is. Therefore, it is quite possible that the model, which is efficient, the bottom model, is actually pointing to the right effect. It is possible. It is plausible. That's why looking at this stuff, it's just insufficient. It's just not enough information for us to speculate which model is correct. And that's why our recommendation is not about the model, it's about the principles. And for example, so it seems silly, but what we are doing here is actually has a very deep philosophical foundation. It's has been shared by many statisticians, which they advocate for people to embrace uncertainty instead of kind of claiming that there's one model and this correct model that can pin down the effect. They advocate for this bottom-up approach where you report multiple models and you just being very transparent about the data and about the models. And instead of just reporting the results, you report kind of a series of results and you discuss the assumptions. And
so
then you
Rashid, if I could just add to that, my interpretation from the 2 examples is what Sergey has outlined is if you don't take the cluster variance into account, you may estimate the wrong result. So Empower D is an example of when you use the cluster variance 3 estimator as opposed to cluster variance 1, your main effect is no longer statistically significant. Whereas in the Link for Health trial, which is the second example in this presentation, it didn't change the overall result. However, you are taking into account the variation. So I think that's the main point here.
Okay, thanks.
That's fine. I really hope it I hope it helped a bit. I think last time I presented that to you, I feel like you were asking the same stuff, and that's why I dropped all the models, because I felt like it's just a bit just doesn't. That's why I only have one model, like only one slide with equations instead of like 6. Yeah.
Are there any other questions?
Yes, I have another question. In terms of variance covariance matrix, if the value of the variance covariance matrix is very high, it can be also referred to this severe level multicollinearity.
Well, you keep saying you keep using those words, and last time I present, and I don't know what that means. I'm sorry. Why do you talk about multicollinearity A, and what's the big matrix? What's the big and small matrix?
This is just for the multicollinearity. This the one of the general linear regression model. One of the assumption that there is no correlation between or among the explanatory or independent variable.
Okay.
And
So, all right. So can I just so multicollinearity, just to be specific, is then one column of the matrix is the same as the other transformed. That's what multicollinearity is, and that's why
if you go with this,
but it has nothing to do with my presentation. Okay, sorry. Go again.
Okay. For my understanding, this the variance covariance matrix, the value of the variance covariance matrix is so high, except the diagonal, the label, it will be referred to this high level multicollinearity. In internal, if you use the internal cluster, it will be highly correlated, and that's why my question is, if it is. If it is work with the default, this multicollinearity problem is overcome with your model, and then in the natural data or in general data, it will not be consistent with this overcome with this multicollinearity problem. This the multicollinearity is very high levels, if you use this one, and it will also violate with this the linear regression model. One of the assumption, it will be violated.
Yeah. All right. Okay. I take your critique, and I'll think about this.
I think there may be some misunderstanding or some confusions about the concept of multicollinearity and heteroscedasticity, because I understand. Are you talking about the variance of residuals of the model, or are you talking about the
these are residuals. That's right.
Residuals, that is heteroscedasticity, because this is not talking about whether there are interactions between independent variables. It's talking about there are the variance or the residuals between clusters. They are correlated, so that's from that matrix, not talking about the independent variables there.
Thanks, Stephen. I think that's very helpful. There's there's a lot of definitions and statistics, and it's
just Sergey's slide just recall me my university lectures decades ago. But for this graph, I would have some comments. Just I found it that is talking about the labeling of the gamma. I think I understand what you mean.
This is alpha. This is alpha, and this is phi.
This will be 2, 3, 2 versus 4, right? Because you're talking about one is not correlated with any at the top left hand side, upper at left hand side. Yeah, that is basically this was not correlated with other clusters. I found the association started between 2 and 3, 2 and 4, right?
2 and so 2 correlates with 2, with 3 and 4. And then 5.
Yeah, so but I can see is your labels are 2, 1, 2, 1, 3. so I will have some difficulty to read this diagram.
Yeah. I see
Just
what
to
you mean.
read.
I see what you mean. So that's why I have like B's here. So this is like 1,
Yeah.
2 within this matrix here. So this is 1, 2, 1, 3. But I know what you mean. I know what you mean, because I said like 2 correlates with 3 and 4, but then these like a different numbers here. Yeah, I see what you mean. So I guess what you're saying is that I can just drop these and have like a cumulative kind of numbering of that. Yeah, I hear you.
And I also think you probably can just give a very short intro about cluster randomized trial first, because you just you started from CRT, but I think that would be good if you can give just look. You don't need to spend a lot of time, but just give a concept
Yep.
about what is CRT, because
I think that's a great idea, because it's a
Yep.
health econometrics
Yep.
conference, and not everybody will have worked with clinical trial data, and not everyone will understand what cluster randomized trials are, and a quick example of one would be great.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep. Thanks.
And one final comment is about, I remember in slide 6 or 7, there are some previous literatures to say
This.
uh,
Even this one.
the previous one.
Yeah.
Yeah, the start with a robust model and then an efficient model. Is that what you would recommend to the audience? Probably for all CRT analysis, we should start from a robust model, and then to go back to our traditional models. Is that what you want to present?
Would you agree that this is like an intuitive approach, because now we first get the result, which imposes no assumptions, right? And so if we get the result and we still get the statistically significant result, then this is excellent, because we don't even have to do robustness checks, because we got the result using the most loose model. But then wouldn't you find that intuitive? Do you agree that would you agree that that's an intuitive approach? Because, well, there's a lot of there's a bunch of books and papers and tons of arguments saying that that's a good approach, but it just seems intuitive, because as all right things. Would you agree? Or
I don't know, because with you are talking about, okay, we like to propose some guidance or some principles for future analysis. So with this is a approach for the audience. Okay, for all CRT, we should first do A and then B before, instead of jumping to the efficient models for all biostats are doing at the moment.
yeah, well, so before jumping in the efficient models, which traditionally assumption driven, but this assumption becomes increasingly implausible, more and more implausible when the pragmatic kind of approaches is becoming more dominant.
Well, maybe that's a good point to put in your recommendation, particularly when you're dealing with analysis of pragmatic cluster randomized trial data.
Say it again, please. Where would I say that? In the at the second
well,
recommendation?
Stephen's question is this your recommendation? Start with a robust model first, transition to efficient. So I think you're making a good case about how common this is ignored or not done perhaps as correctly or accurately as it could be, where there are pragmatic randomized control trials, cluster trials. So I think making the case that in the situation of pragmatic trials, that you may be wanting to start with a robust model first, because there's a higher likelihood that there is more heteroscedasticity there and that variance has not been appropriately handled.
Yep. So because remember I was in the beginning, I was saying do not over rely on stochastic correlation. Because maybe I can say it here, because in the cross correlation coefficients, it's kind of tricky, because intercrossing correlation coefficient, it has a proper full kind of high definition kind of. It has
Yeah.
but the one that is used, and these things are used interchangeably, is that the random effect, the cluster correlation. And so it doesn't have to be so. It's the formula which is currently used to calculate this coefficient is simplified, and it's taken as if this is step 0, but it's not step 0. It's a coefficient which is valid after the assumptions of equicorrelation. Equicorelation is imposed. So it's very hard to kind of say things which are correct and also be understood correctly, because
I mean, you could just say avoiding over-reliance on the ICC.
Over-reliance, yeah.
Over-reliance,
Sorry.
I think Mason's got a question now.
Yep.
Hey, sir. Thanks for the great talk. I just had a couple of questions, and I think a couple of points that I wanted to ask was asked by Stephen regarding like giving more information about the difference. I mean, some examples of difference between the pragmatic and non-pragmatic. I don't know if all your audience would know or wouldn't know. I certainly didn't know. My question was like first about, you talked about the sample size in the biostatistics or econometrics. How, like, what is, when you say it is larger or is it smaller, how, I just curious how large they are or how small they are, what is like average larger sample size in econometrics?
Well, when you think about, so they're bigger because, for example, when you let's say it's very common in applied econometrics to use national household surveys. And for example, let's say it can be like English panel has like 300,000 people. It's crazy.
Yes. Okay.
And for example, Australian panel has about, I want to say 20,000. So these are big sample sizes. This is sample sizes where you can allow yourself to be inefficient. But the the benefit of that is that you can allow yourself to be robust. Do you know what I mean? So because you can use methods which just use little assumptions, and that's critical because in quasi-experimental literature, further assumptions are just might get you in a really strange place. But
so
am I answering your question? Because maybe I missed
I think
something.
you're talking about
I just wanted to get a
sample size.
sense of about what sort of
What about cluster sizes though? You're talking about panel data being 300,000, etc. But I think there's a good question there about the size of the clusters.
So in the paper I cited paper in the paper based on on the actual paper for this project. So I found a paper which looks at the evolution of sample sizes for like the last decades or two, and they sort of clearly say that the average sample sizes for biostats kind of have been sort of smallish, but they got bigger, and that's because I'm not answering your question. So because well, like I said, for example, let's say that I'm sorry, I don't know what the question.
I get what you.
It's hard
I just wanted to get a feel for how big when you say big, like how.
It could be different. For example, I know that there's some CRTs that run randomization in all European countries, and then you have like 100 clusters, 100 clinics, like 200 clinics with like 50,000 people. And actually in setting like this, you probably can just use CV1. You don't have to use CV3.
So you might want to say, Sergey, because I know we've talked about this a little bit, where you have a trial that has fewer than, for instance, 30 clusters, or a number where
there's no number. That's the thing. I mean,
I know there's no number, but
it's so hard to like put this across is that there is no like magic bullet. There's no like test that would like do all that stuff for you. There's no like number that makes some model valid and the other invalid. There's just because it's not only about the cluster numbers, it's about cluster heterogeneity in the sense that for example, there's a famous rule of 42 in econometrics. So if there's more than 41 clusters, you can't use if there's less than 42 clusters, you can't use CV1, cluster robust variance estimator, because But that's not right. There's papers on that saying that if they're of different sizes, it's as bad as having like 5 clusters.
Yeah.
And there is
Yeah.
like 10 different diagnostics you can do. Like, you know, you can look at the efficient sample size, this efficient cluster correlate. You know, there's so many diagnostics, but the thing is that all of this is the best diagnostics you can think of, you know, and it's this one. It's this one. It's really nice because it does not depend on any assumption, anything. It's just you delete the cluster and see what happens. And this stuff has been advocated for so long in biostat space too.
Yeah. So
Yeah, sorry.
I just wanted to also ask about this. What you're saying is, have you done a scoping review of how widely used these methods are? Because I think you're relying on the assumption that these are sort of the methods that are advocated in, I guess, textbook sort of setting. Like this is what is recommended mostly in lectures and things. But is it like how widely it is used in like biostatistics or anything?
Yeah,
I think
well,
that's something I would sort of like to know. Like, is it when
yeah,
when you're saying that, is that
yeah, but it's just I mean, so it's so tightly in, like you don't really even have to. I mean, I guess in the paper we have first 2 paragraphs. I have like a review of papers that kind of discuss this problem within the domain of medicine. They sort of this acknowledgement that when you have, you know, few clusters, that the models currently used are kind of inappropriate. So we do talk about this. But the thing is that cluster correlation is such a, it's an assumption that basically runs biostats. And why it runs biostats? Because it simplifies power identification for the because it's very hard to simulate data when you don't assume when you do away from cluster correlation. So for example, when you specify this process, for example, well, usually you specify kind of when you try to estimate the power and the needed sample size, you know, for your protocol, you have to assume, you usually assume some sort of process, and this is a cluster correlated process, and this is what is used, and that is what goes into protocols, and that's what it goes into the papers. But if you then, and that's kind of the problem, is that when you kind of then in a later evaluation you actually acknowledge the cluster correlation is not available by assumptions, it breaks everything apart, because it means that your power calculation was not accurate. It means that your protocol wasn't accurate. But do I make sense? This is just the way how discipline is ran.
okay.
So I
understand your opinion. I had another
well,
question about the computational issues. I did not understand how you got around the computational issues, because like usually they sort of assume something that reduce the number of parameters, right? So you're saying that's you don't need to do it here, or
you don't have to do that. It's in the paper. It's in a GE paper. They say example number 1, and that's what the econometricians are doing day and night. They run regressions, they burn their computers, and what they do is this: you just do a linear model, a Poisson model, and you don't specify. You just basically use just the most. You don't have to do any. You don't have to specify correlation within clusters. All you do is just you use cluster robust variance estimator. And it says the result in the paper, in GE paper, says that you will get your consistent standard errors, but you can gain efficiency if you do specify variance covariance metrics within clusters. And if you specify it well, you might gain efficiency.
No, that's true. But I'm just saying, like, so you're saying it doesn't add any computational sort of hurdles if you
specifying this step, specifying variance within clusters, could be extremely computationally intensive. And that's another reason why cluster correlation is an assumption used, because then you can use a simpler model, such as hierarchical models, because there's a cluster correlation can be cluster. These random effects for the cluster can be put into conditional mean function, and that becomes a random effect model, or like generalized mixed effect model, and that it implies the choice of variance covariance metrics. It makes the VCM be cluster correlated, but within GE framework, you don't have conditional mean function doesn't have that parameter. You do it directly into variance covariance metrics. but it's the same treatment of the uncertainty.
There's a question from Basio in the chat. Basio, do you want to come off mute and ask your question?
So efficiency is, I can just do it. Maybe in bath, just having a bath.
Yes, thank you.
So this efficiency, it's not a controversial, it's not like an ambiguous term. Efficiency means, so the estimators have certain qualities, desired qualities, and one of the qualities are being unbiased, consistent, and efficient. For example, it is well known that, so, there's something called BLUE, best linear unbiased estimator. For example, it is known that, for example, if the homoscedasticity assumption in the data is valid, if your errors are homoscedastic, it means that you can run your linear model estimated with OLS, and that OLS estimator would be unbiased, consistent, efficient, so you would get the smallest standard errors possible. There is no other estimator that can give you smaller standard errors. And you can see that actually this is kind of the same thing. So why OLS works so well? Because we, instead of allowing for arbitrary standard errors, we assume them. So OLS is the most efficient, and it's BLUE because instead of using data to estimate uncertainty, we assume uncertainty. And then homoscedastic errors is when, so this variance would be just one parameter, sigma square usually, it's called spherical errors. It's the same mechanics that makes GE more efficient, is when we, instead of using data to estimate uncertainty, which in turn allows arbitrary correlation and arbitrary, so there's no reliance on distributional, you don't have to assume that your Y comes from some distribution. So that's what efficiency is in statistics.
Yeah, thank you.
No, I'm happy to kind of tell more. I probably said more than you needed to. I don't know.
It's 12 o'clock now. Do people, anyone else online have some other questions?
Can I make one minor
Aaron.
comment? Sorry.
Yes.
This is just right at the end when you're presenting the results of the simulation models in the graph. Just a presentation thing. Is there a reason the color is different for the same model in the two graphs? Because I found that a little bit tricky to follow, but I'm not sure if you had a reason.
Yeah, no, there's no reason for that. I mean, the only reason is that it's just this paper is still in a working state, and I just had to do something.
Karen. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So yesterday I have to do them the same color. And then I was trying to do it, and somehow it broke everything. And I was like, "Oh my God, I can't do this. Not now. I don't have time for this now." But yeah, thank you.
Totally understand. But I found this very helpful to follow, not coming from a econometrics background. So yeah.
I will probably when I present this, I'll apologize for confusing legends. Colors, because that's an obvious kind of eyesore. Yeah.
And a couple of other just quite minor points for me that might help in your delivery. I thought where you first mentioned, it's not on the slide, but you first mentioned jackknife. So slide 8. I think you started to talk about really defining CV3, right? And then you started to talk about, your jackknife and robust errors. And I just thought it'd be good to define that a little bit more, because that's a key component. So you might want to spend a minute on that. You got time because you included in your 30 minutes our questions. And the other, there's just a small thing, slide 12 in the heading. I think slide 11, you had defined your variance covariance matrix. So that's fine. Don't worry about that. Slide 13, I just thought here you could possibly take a minute. With your bottom two estimators, your CV1 and your CV3, you could just take a minute here to describe the difference between CV1 and CV3. So your whole presentation is really about this, but here is where I think you've got an opportunity to point out the differences. And I just thought that would be helpful to do that as you're going through these estimators. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
yeah, you know, otherwise, yeah, no, otherwise I think it's going to generate, you know, quite a lot of questions and discussion. You don't have to run through it because 30 minutes is actually quite a long time to present. And then you'll have the opportunity for the discussant to lead questions and ask questions after that. So you got time to go through all of your content. Yeah.
Yep. Awesome. Thank you so much. I feel really good about all that stuff because I was worried that I'll embarrass myself at the workshop, but I think I'll be fine.
I think you'll be fine. Yeah. Excellent. Oh, good luck with it, Sergey.
Thank you. Thank you so much
Thanks.
for,
Yeah.
you know, showing up and, you know, have a wonderful Friday and a weekend and, you know, thanks again.
Yeah, you too. And good luck. And we look forward
Yeah.
to hearing how it's received next week.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Rashid, we will talk more about stuff, I promise. Okay. Bye-bye. Bye now. Leaving.